Hi, Michael.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm fine, and you?
I'm good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Michael Young, opinion editor of the Daily Star and author of The Ghosts of Martyrs Square. Is that correct?
The last I heard.
The last you heard. Well, these things don't change. Some things change and some things don't.
That's right.
So you're in Lebanon, much closer than I am to Syria, and maybe uncomfortably close. I don't know how you feel about that. But how do things look in Syria from where you stand?
Well, I think the situation in Syria is, I think it's not very different from what it looks like from other places where, you know, the situation is getting worse. Mm-hmm. The regime refuses to leave power, is continuing to use, all the means possible, violent means possible to stay in power. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a very strong perception, or let me say an increasingly strong perception in Beirut and I think elsewhere, that the regime is, not going to survive this. But at the same time, that the situation can last, that this situation can last for a time, but that Bashar, the regime of Bashar al-Assad, will not be able to reimpose, if you will, to put the genie in the bottle. He won't be able to take Syria back to where it was a year ago.
And yet, I haven't heard a plausible, graceful transition scenario lately. Now the Arab League has finished its, 1-month monitoring period and will issue a report, but certainly it didn't show evidence of having some kind of magic plan. There has been a call by, the Emir of Qatar to actually intervene, that Arab nations should intervene militarily, right? But I don't think that's getting a lot of support in the Arab world. I don't know. Do you see? I mean, what's the bright scenario here?
No, I agree. There is no bright scenario. The bright scenario is one that that it remains unpredictable. It's that the regime will collapse suddenly, and that Syria, will go into a transition towards a more open, more pluralistic, a more democratic order. But I mean, I don't think many people would bet on that in the immediate future. Having said that, these kinds of regimes, I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that these kinds of regimes can, at one point, suddenly something can crack, something decisive can crack. Now, that doesn't mean that it will be, a sudden catastrophic breakdown. Remember, it is the minority Alawi community that is in control in Syria.
True.
No, so I think what we should think of at some point is that if the Alawis begin realizing that they're not going to win this, perhaps they will then resort to a plan B. And what is that plan B? There has been talk time and again, even within, it seems, the Alawi community of a pullback towards the Alawi heartland. They would control weapons. I think that scenario has many problems to it, but at the same time, it's equally plausible that the Alawis could be thinking of that, at least the Alawi chiefs, even if that plan will not work, even if that plan is I think, bound to fail. But they don't really have plan C, I think.
As far as near-term collapse goes, it seems to me it's often the case that, even dictators have a lot of domestic allies. I mean, there's a tendency for America to think that whenever there's someone we consider an evil dictator or an authoritarian, that it really is almost literally autocratic, that kind of everyone wants to get rid of them, and so it's just a question of time. But it usually turns out that authoritarian leaders, somewhat like leaders of democracies, need to have constituencies. They need to have, to stay in power, a fairly large number of people who view themselves as benefiting from the rule of the leader. And for that reason, it's often harder to usher them out of power than we anticipate. So, for example, This is why I think we didn't anticipate the Sunni insurgency in Iraq. We had this caricature of Saddam Hussein as sitting atop an entire nation of discontented people. I mean, so I'm inclined to worry that the collapse scenario, any near-term collapse scenario, kind of underestimates the amount of domestic support that Assad may have. Does that seem crazy?
Obviously this is a big question. I think certainly Assad has some domestic support, but from what I'm hearing, even constituencies that supported the regime, and we're talking, the business class in Damascus, even in Aleppo, primarily a Sunni business class, also has begun to turn against the regime for a number of reasons. Obviously, there is that sectarian problem that the regime itself provoked. But at the same time, even for business, today continuation of the regime is basically tantamount to continuation of Syria's economic decline. The Syrian pound has lost a tremendous percentage of its value, even in recent days. So that I think from what I'm hearing, even in places like Damascus and Aleppo, we are beyond the tipping point. Now, that doesn't mean that these people will take to the streets necessarily, although there have been videos of small groups of people demonstrating in the area of Mezzi, which is an upscale Syrian neighborhood. Not a lot of people, but the fact that these people can come out in Mezzi and demonstrate against Bashar's regime, if that's confirmed, this is stuff that was uploaded on YouTube, I think is significant. And again, as I said, I'm hearing that a number of the constituencies that were with the regime or that were on the fence have begun to change direction. To in a way, they've now turned much more openly against the regime.
And is the business class overwhelmingly Sunni? Because sometimes you have a situation where the minority, there may be a minority sect, comparable to the Alawites in this case, but they actually dominate the commercial class. Is it the case that in Syria, really the bulk of the economic power is in non-Alawite hands?
Well, I think it's a mixture. I mean, obviously the elite around Bashar, the Alawi elite, did penetrate the economy in substantial ways, and that's perhaps one source of resentment against them. And so certainly there is a small Alawi elite that became very wealthy under the regime of the Assads. But at the same time, we're talking here about the Sunni, when I talk about the business class, it's businessmen, but it can even be things like the Su, the sort of the conservative core of the Sunni community, those in the marketplace, the Su of Damascus. I've heard, even with journalists showing up, they will be very critical, openly critical of the regime, whereas perhaps a few months ago they would have hesitated to do this, to say anything. The thing is, at this point, Bob, I mean, you're right. There are people who are with the regime, but when we say with the regime, I think we need to qualify that in some way. People are not with the Assads because necessarily they like the Assads. People were, obviously the Alawi community is very fearful that if the Sunnis take over, they will lose their prerogatives, there will be, revenge, and so on and so forth. So there is a sectarian fear. There are other minorities, again, who are fearful, the Christians, although even in the Christian community, you hear anecdotally of changes, change in attitudes. There are the Druze, and as well. I mean, the minorities have tended to be a bit fearful. But it's not because they like the Assads. It's because, in a sense, they fear that they may pay a price for any kind of dramatic change. And then there are those who were with the regime out of interest, because somehow the regime represented for them prosperity, stability, whatever. Now, all that in a way has collapsed. The regime today is not really does not represent in any way stability anymore. On the contrary, its continuation in power represents instability. And so, in a way, the final bastion of the regime, I feel, is simply this Alawi solidarity and control of the weapons, which is why we've seen that Bashar has been unable really to engage in any kind of meaningful reform or political initiative. The only thing the regime really is doing is repressing. Despite talk of reform, there's no real reform taking place in Syria. The regime cannot engage in that. And so I think really we're really at the final bastion, the final barrier, if you want, that the regime has. It's weapons. They have weapons, I think. But what we're seeing again is a growing militarization of the rebellion against the regime, and of course the fear down the road that this will lead to a wider civil conflict.
Yeah. So, what would that look like? I mean, if we don't wind up with the relatively good news that you're suggesting is plausible, that in other words the tipping point is actually quite near, and there could be...
No, I think we're beyond the tipping point. I frankly think that we're beyond the tipping point. And to be very honest, I thought we were beyond the tipping point last summer. But I think that too much of a focus was on, well, will the Syrian business class support Bashar or not? I think from the moment you had these rolling demonstrations throughout the country, from Homs, Hama, Deir ez-Zor, Daraa, you had suddenly a proliferation of anti-regime demonstrations. I thought the tipping point had been reached. But today, yes, even in places like Damascus and Aleppo, I think we're beyond the tipping point.
Okay, so we're beyond the tipping point in the sense that the regime cannot survive in the long run, you think. But I take it we're not past the tipping point in the sense of a necessarily sudden collapse and transition to a new government. In other words, you do envision the possibility of something like, when you say sustained civil conflict or whatever, you're talking about a civil war, an ongoing civil war, I take it.
Yes, but civil war, I always a little bit hesitate to use that word, because civil war, you really have then a machinery of war that goes beyond just the military means. In a sense, society becomes almost enlisted in this conflict. You really have almost a leviathan of war. I think in Syria today, it's strange. If Bashar, let's say, were to decide today, I'm leaving Syria. Syria would avoid a civil war, in the sense that I'm not saying that I don't believe structurally that the country is destined to enter into a civil war. The problem, though, is that if the regime continues to defend its interests militarily with this level of violence, the only way you can remove it is through a comparable level of violence.
Right.
But at the level of hearts, at the level of institutions, at the level of society, I think a vast majority of people in Syria do not want a civil war. They're not willing to engage in a civil war, even if they are willing to come out and protest against the government. When I say engage in a civil war as active combatants or create a network to support combat, I mean, it's a fine line.
Yeah. But
I come from a country which had 15 years of civil war, and in a sense, you could just feel that the mobilization at the level of society was deeper. I think we're not there yet in Syria, and I hope we won't get there.
But that suggests to me that then the regime could hang on for quite a while, because ultimately what it has to fear, right, is a significant armed rebellion, right?
Well, I think so, but remember, I mean, what you've got is a core of Alawi leaders, most of them coming from the security forces, the military, and so forth. Bashar at the top and the Assad family at the top. Now, they've been trying since, let's say, March, to crush what's going on. They've lost ground. They haven't gained ground. By and large, they've lost ground. There are parts of the country they don't control really anymore. The opposition is increasingly bold. Now, but it's a small group of people who are trying somehow, when they meet once a day or every 2 days or whatever, when they meet in their little committees in Damascus, that is trying to find the magic bullet to this, and they haven't. Now, it is conceivable that that the solidarity within that small group at some stage will begin to fray, that that there will emerge a sort of a sense among the Alawis that, look, we're not winning this. We should really seriously begin to think of Plan B, because we're not going to win this. And that's in a way where almost the doubts begin to creep in. If you begin debating, anything other than more repression, then you're going to begin to have cracks in how to deal with this. And I think that's an important stage when things become complicated for the regime. On top of that, of course, you do have economic stresses, economic pressures on the regime, of course, but as well as on Syrian society. So while I tend to agree with you, this can last. It certainly can last. It can last for as long as the regime manages to impose, unanimity in the ranks. But, for every week and month that this goes on, the credibility of Bashar, the credibility of the Assads, the credibility of those in charge is declining. You see, so that different ideas are going to pop up and different demands, even from within the Alawi community, I feel. Yeah. It's difficult to monitor this. You can hear here and there, stories, but I think that's also where we should look. You see, it can last a long time, but if that solidarity breaks down, the regime can also quickly move to a Plan B.
Now, there have been some calls for intervention. Some people, I mentioned the Qatar's suggestion of Arab intervention. There's some people calling for a Libyan-style intervention. Now, literally following the Libya model seems impossible, since Russia has ruled out supporting that in the Security Council. So it's hard to imagine something that would have the kind of UN sanction that the Libyan intervention had. But there are people who are calling for something, structurally similar in terms of the intervention itself. Does that seem to you either in the cards or advisable?
Well, look, I think that the proposal of the Emir of Qatar was, I don't think he expected his plan to be implemented imminently. And it was a vague proposal. He said we need to deploy Arab troops to end the bloodshed, or to end the killing. Now, he didn't really specify in what context. He didn't really specify if these troops were to be a peacekeeping force or a more aggressive intervention force. As you know, there has been talk in recent weeks and months of creating humanitarian corridors in Syria. In other words, territory inside Syrian territory that can be held by outside forces. At the time, people had mentioned Turkey, towards which Syrians could essentially gravitate to be in a way to protect themselves from the regime. At the same time, corridors through which humanitarian aid could pass to help Syrian areas being oppressed by the regime. It's easy to talk about corridors, but the real point here is to create autonomous territories or areas where inside Syrian territory, in a way to tell the Assad regime, look, there are parts of this country you cannot control, and where we're going to protect Syrians, but also eventually, or possibly, or potentially, where you can set up an alternative government.
So now, you would wind up with international troops? Is that the idea?
He was proposing Arab troops, not international troops.
Oh, okay.
So you're quite right when you said earlier that the Arab states are very reluctant to engage in that kind of operation today. But I think he opened he opened the box, the Pandora's box, by throwing that on the table. And that idea, I think, can make the rounds. I mean, let's take a scenario, for instance, where the Alawi regime, the Bashar's regime, does begin thinking more seriously of falling back on the Alawi heartland. Well, that kind of project becomes quite interesting, because what it really means is that the Arabs will intervene, quite possibly to prevent the formation of a Alawi statelet, of a small Alawi state. You see, that they would intervene in effect to support the Syrians in their desire to impose unity of Syria, not to allow the regime to create a separate sectarian heartland for the Alawi community. You see what I'm saying? In other words, it opens the door towards action in the future, and I think the Arabs have to seriously consider this option, even if they don't today consider it. But down the road, if there is going to be military intervention in Syria, it has to be Arab. It's not going to be, as you said, it's not going to come from the West. And I don't think it's going to come from Turkey, because the Turks are very reluctant to enter Syria, because this would alarm the Kurds in Syria, who would, So ideally would be an Arab force in support of the Syrians, and presumably in support of the Free Syrian Army. They were not there yet.
There was a piece on foreignpolicy.com yesterday, I think, by Mark Lynch, a kind of prominent American scholar and blogger about the Middle East and Arab societies. It was an argument against military intervention, and one point he made, and I don't know to what extent this would apply to the kind of Arab intervention you're talking about, but he said right now there's almost no territory controlled by regime opponents. It's not like Libya, where the whole area around Benghazi was in rebel hands. I gather there is a town actually near the Lebanese borders, Zabadani, which may be largely or entirely in the hand of regime opponents. But by and large, there are not clear demarcations of turf between regime and regime opponents, and that most of the fighting is in these kind of dense urban areas. And he just pointed out that would seem to will certainly complicate any kind of largely air-based intervention of the kind we saw in Libya. But I've got to think it complicates any armed intervention, right?
Yes, certainly. Today, that's correct. Which is why I said I think we should take this more seriously, this proposal, in the context of a potential Plan B by the regime. You see a pullback towards a prospective Alawi area. Having said that, I mean, let's be very clear. In a town like Latakia, in Ledi, as they call it in Arabic, you do have a Sunni majority, if I'm correct. In other words, even the thought of an Alawi statelet would involve a great deal of ethnic cleansing. And let's remember, Alawis are not necessarily concentrated in the Alawi heartland. In recent decades, they've moved out into the plain around Homs. They've moved to Damascus. I mean, obviously, any such project would be traumatic to everyone involved. But I think it's only realistic as a plan, because that's the only plan there is if the regime fails to repress. It's not like the regime has left itself a lot of options.
So you see ultimate partition as...
I think it'll fail. I think that we should think, if the regime cannot repress, it's going to think of a Plan B. The only realistic Plan B, I think, as far as they're concerned, is either a collapse of the regime, because something breaks down at the heart of the regime, perhaps even potentially a coup from within the regime. That's not very likely. Or they maintain to a certain extent their solidarity with each other, and they say, all right, well, we can't do this, we've got to pull back. Again, how likely is that? I don't know, but it's not like there are many, many other options. Either there is a sudden collapse from within, or some kind of coup, or else that a more organized pullback towards the Alawi heartland. That's,
okay. Well, finally, let me just ask you. The one town that, or one of the towns that, maybe the only town that is anything like rebel occupied is this town of Zabadani, I gather, and that's on the Lebanese border. Is there any fear in Lebanon of this becoming violent on a larger scale and spilling over into Lebanon?
Sure, there is that fear, but at the same time, I think, I don't feel on a daily basis, at least in Beirut, that this is the fear level. Obviously, there are parts of the country where you have much more mobilization. In the north of Lebanon, where you have a heavily Sunni population, there is more mobilization or more. Maybe they're watching this much more closely. But even that, I think we should be aware. The Lebanese do not, I think, want to. A vast majority of Lebanese do not want to collapse or fall into a new war over Syria. Who would fight in Lebanon? Presumably, it would be Hezbollah, which supports the Syrian regime, and those opposed to the Syrian regime. But I mean, we're not talking about equal forces here. Hezbollah still has by far a military superiority over those who oppose Syria. And at the same time, let's be honest, I think no one really wants to engage in a war, not Hezbollah and not the vast majority of those who dislike the Assad regime. And frankly, I think Hezbollah knows very well, I mean, they're not stupid. They see that the Syrian regime is probably not salvageable. So they're going to think of Plan B. I think they've probably already thought of Plan B, their own Plan B, or Plan C, I don't know. But it does not involve entering into a civil war in Lebanon against against the Sunnis. So I think what we have here is sort of a tense standoff, but at the same time, you would be surprised. It's not something that you feel is, that the country is on the verge of a conflict.
Right. And do you think, by the way, that Iran has given up on the Syrian regime? Do we have much evidence about what Iran is or isn't doing to support the regime?
Look, if Hezbollah if Hezbollah believes that it's probably not salvageable, I'm sure the Iranians believe the same thing. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that Bashar. That Bashar is not going to put the genie back into the bottle. I think, but again, the Iranians today have they're facing quite a few challenges, not only the Syrian challenge, but obviously their own situation with the United States and Israel. Now, they will continue to support Bashar's regime as best they can. I don't think they will give up in the sense that they will simply say, all right, manage on your own. But I think everybody realizes that at some point they have to prepare for the aftermath.
Okay. Well, I hope you're right that maybe the aftermath is sooner than we think. I mean, if the alternative is really sustained violence.
I mean, yeah, it could take months. I mean, I'm certainly not ruling out violence. I certainly am not ruling it out. I wish I could, but I'm not. But it's either violence or at some point the Alawis realize that they can't sustain this in the long term, so they think of some other options. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you. Anything else in the region that's going on that we should be apprised of? Anything in Lebanon or?
In Lebanon, not much. It's a wait and see. I mean, I think there's quite a bit with regard to Iran, with regard to what's going on in Egypt. With obviously the Egyptian elections. I mean, there's quite a lot going on. We can spend hours on this.
Yeah. Well, just let's spend one more minute. How does Iran look from where the Iran situation? From where I stand, it seems to be to have heated up at least within the last 2 weeks, although it may have cooled within the last day or two. But how does it look from there?
Once again, I mean, in Lebanon, people just watch. They're never quite sure what's going on. But I think the the Israeli announcement yesterday to the effect that an attack was really quite a time away and so on, which was quite apparently coordinated, I suppose, with the United States to calm a little bit the situation. I think that in the last 24 hours there's been a sense that, okay, this is a little bit calmer. That doesn't prevent, some kind of mistake being made, but I think everyone is conscious of this. And quite frankly, I'm not really sure anyone wants the idea that the Iranians may be looking for a conflict to sort of unify ranks before the elections in March is not something that convinces me terribly.
No, I think they want a sense. They may want a sense of threat to unify the populace, but I doubt they want a war. I mean, I worry more about Israel wanting the war.
But I think the Israelis, what we understood in the last 24 hours and even before that is that the U.S. doesn't want a war and made that clear to the Israelis. The Iranians, but, again, even the sense of threat today in Iran, I'm not sure, I'm not a specialist on Iran, but can you really guarantee, if you're the Iranian regime, that any kind of conflict will rally everyone to your side? I'm not sure it's quite as predictable as people think. We should remember that what happened with the presidential election. We should remember, that there are genuine differences between within the so-called conservative ranks. I'm not sure that you can just assume automatically that if there is a conflict, the Iranians will rally behind the regime. I think it would be, it might be messier than that.
Yeah. Well, and you never know how the sanctions work. On the one hand, they could embitter people toward the people imposing the sanctions. On the other hand, they could embitter people toward the regime if they hold the regime responsible. And I never know how to predict how that's going to work.
Right.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
I hope you're right in your more optimistic speculations.
I hope I'm right too.
Okay. Well, I'll bet you always hope you're right, but in this case, there's a second reason for you to hope you're right. Okay. Thanks so much.
Okay, Bob. Thank you very much. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.